Hello, I'm Lorelei Corcoran, Professor and Director of the Institute of Egyptian Art and Archaeology at the University of Memphis. It is my great pleasure to introduce Kevin Johnson, Associate Professor of History and Chair of the History, Global, and Political Studies Department at Taylor University in Upland, Indiana. As a graduate of both our MA and PhD programs in Egyptology at the University of Memphis, Dr. Johnson will present the 4th annual Alumni Lecture in Egyptology, a series initiated to bring University of Memphis graduates back to campus to discuss their current research and to serve as models of success for our enrolled students. This year's lecture will be virtual, and we will miss seeing Kevin in person, but we look forward to this opportunity to share his lecture and our series with a broader audience, since this lecture will also be available for future viewing on a University of Memphis YouTube channel. In addition to his MA and PhD studies in Egyptian art and history at the University of Memphis, Dr. Johnson earned an MA in Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations from the University of Chicago, as well as an MA in theology from Harding University. He participated as an epigrapher in the University of Arizona field expedition at the mortuary temple of one of Egypt's female pharaohs, Tawaseret, and leads his students on study trips to Egypt for Taylor University. His present research in history, as evidenced by his article, Prince Seti Merimta, Chancellor Bai, and the Bark Shrine of Seti II at Karnak in the Journal of Egyptian History, addresses issues of legitimacy and power behind the throne. But this talk will focus on a subject that first engaged him while writing his MA thesis at the University of Memphis, a collection of limestone sarcophagus fragments in the Egyptian Institute's own collection that, through his investigative research, he has matched to other fragments in museums and private collections in North America and in England, thereby making possible a virtual reconstruction of the original coffin. Please enjoy this presentation by Kevin Johnson, Gathering the Pieces, an iconographic analysis and virtual reconstruction of a New Kingdom non-royal sarcophagus.
Thank you, Dr. Corcoran, for that introduction. It's an honor to be asked to give this talk for the annual IEAA Alumni Lecture Series. I have so many fond memories of my time at the IEAA and the University of Memphis, giving tours of the West African and Egyptian collections, helping with the installation of the Gods of Ancient Memphis exhibit in 2001, and also the concurrent Eternal Egypt exhibit that included masterworks from the British Museum and were at least temporarily housed in the pyramid. Those were the pre-Bass Pro Shop days for the pyramid, mind you. Attending the movie premiere of The Mummy Returns with IEAA faculty and students. I had such a great time that night. And also taking really great courses like Ancient Egyptian Portraiture, one of Dr. Corcoran's classes, where I really learned to appreciate and to see Egyptian art in completely different ways. And of course, this present talk has its genesis during my time as a master's student, where I was first introduced to pieces of a sarcophagus that were in the art museum in the storage area as part of a bequest in 1994 in honor of Glenn White, a former Air Force Master Sergeant and part-time antiquities collector. Subsequently, I was made aware of the locations of additional pieces of the sarcophagus through contacts with Nicholas Reeves, Melinda Hartwig, Ed Blyberg, Fred Albertson, and also Dr. Corcoran. Though not all of the sarcophagus pieces have been found and located, there are enough that we can reconstruct most of it, albeit virtually. And examine its iconographic program. And that is in fact the focus of this current talk. Now, for a little historical context, the sarcophagus under discussion belongs to a hatia, basically a mayor, named Mena from the ancient town of Ninnesut. This is the what the ancient Greeks would call Heracleopolis. Here you can see a map showing the location of Heracleopolis. This is near the modern town of Inacia el Medina. It's roughly about 70 miles or so south of Cairo. Heracleopolis was important during several different periods of Egyptian history, most notably during the First Intermediate Period. It was the center of power for the 9th and 10th dynasty rulers. Also during the New Kingdom, especially during the 19th dynasty, it became important. There are a number of Ramesside remains at Heracleopolis. The sarcophagus under discussion was first discovered during excavations conducted at Sedmet. This was the name of the necropolis that serviced Heracleopolis. Here you can see in this map the proximity of Sedmet, the necropolis, to the town and the city of Heracleopolis. The cemetery had seen attention from archaeologists during several different stints, including in 1893 under the Swiss Egyptologist Edward Neville. About a decade later, Corelli and Lote excavating for Sir Flinders Petrie. And finally, the third period of excavation, which took place from December 1920 to April of 1921, Guy Brunton excavating under the supervision of Sir Flinders Petrie. And this is the phase of excavation that Mena's tomb was actually discovered. In fact, the tomb was designated 1955 by Guy Brunton. And here is an image of Guy Brunton taking a much needed rest from a hard day's work. Most of us probably understand the heat of the Egyptian sun and understand why he would need to take a little bit of a break here. In the excavation report, he's actually going to describe entering Mena's tomb as follows. He says, the shaft of 1955 over 24 feet deep led into a large room on the north, or rather northwest. Out of this on the north opened two smaller rooms with floors at a rather higher level. In the southeast corner was a trench roughly cut about 70 by 110 inches and 4 feet deep, containing the white limestone sarcophagus inscribed for Mena. The two coffins had been of wood, painted black, inscribed in yellow, but the whole burial had been burnt. Very little remained in the room, and what there was included rubbish left by the tomb makers and undertakers. Now, I will describe a number of the contents that he found in the tomb, and I will explain why it is that Brunton and his crew recorded some items and other items simply did not record them. But to give you an idea of how much is here at Sedmet, and maybe to give Brunton a little bit of a break as well. On the left-hand side here, you can see these little square and rectangular areas that have been labeled with letters of the alphabet. Each one of these, imagine that this were a sort of Google Earth slide. And what we were going to do now is we see each of these letters of the alphabet, and now we're looking at G. We're going to zoom in and actually see a little bit closer. And in fact, if we do that, just G, and G is the area, by the way, where Mena's tomb was actually located and that sarcophagus was found. If we look on the right-hand side, we've just zoomed in on G, and you get a sense of just how much is there. There's a lot. You would hardly be able to walk in this area without tripping over some part of, the area above a shaft that is leading down to a tomb. And so, in fact, 1955 Minna's tomb is not even listed here on this particular map. So this gives you an idea of just how much is there at Sedmet. Now, the grave goods in the tomb contained a number of grave goods. Some of these items were drawn, photographed, and removed. One item actually ended up in the Cairo Museum, and it's one of my favorite pieces. It's this decorative cylindrical wooden toilet box. It came into the Cairo Museum with a designation JE 47010, and it's absolutely wonderful. It has this flying gallop scene featuring a lion chasing a gazelle. This is actually an artistic motif that is imported from the Aegean. Other notable objects found in the tomb included a Canaanite amphora, and some remains in the Canaanite amphora showed evidence of incense. There's also a Mycenaean stirrup jar, which was drawn by Brunton or his crew. And also, Brunton references the remains of 2 black wooden coffins with yellow decoration. Now, these were black coffins with yellow decoration were pretty common, roughly the middle of the 18th dynasty, let's say the reign of Hatshepsut, all the way down to through the end of the reign of Ramses II. It's curious that with so little remaining of those black coffins that Brunton was able to determine that there had been 2 of them. And we could only imagine then that maybe these were nested coffins, one inside the other, and then those 2 were inside of Minna's limestone sarcophagus. But apparently there are just fragments that are left. In fact, the lack of human remains and those destroyed coffins are evidence that the tomb had been plundered in antiquity. The mummy probably burnt in order to extract the amulets that were inside of the wrappings. The stone sarcophagus was not removed, presumably due to its size and the difficulty of hoisting it up a shaft that's 24 feet deep. It would have been very difficult to do. What is unfortunate is that no drawings or photographs were made of the sarcophagus in situ. Brunton's team was pretty selective in what they chose to draw and photograph. Apparently, items that were taken out of the shaft might have been drawn and photographed occasionally, but if things were left in, maybe like those fragments of the black coffin that Brunton did not consider worthy of recording or bringing up, and also the sarcophagus, which for one reason or another was not drawn. Now, here's an image of the black coffin with yellow inscription. This is not Minna's coffin. This is just an example because we have absolutely no idea what those fragments actually looked like because Brunton simply left them in there. So all we have of the sarcophagus or the description of the sarcophagus is simply what I have read you earlier, and obviously the pieces that I will show you today. Sometime after Brunton's excavation work at Sedmet was completed, Minna's tomb was re-entered by looters, and the sarcophagus was cut into sections, and this allowed the robbers to more easily remove and to transport those pieces. So it's easier to get a piece of that sarcophagus up the 24-foot shaft than it would be to try to drag the whole thing out. And in fact, this practice of dismantling by looters was quite common in the late 19th and early 20th centuries and allowed the pieces to be more easily sold on the Egyptian antiquities market. The sections of Minna's sarcophagus were dispersed in exactly this manner, and they ended up in private hands or the collections of various museums. And sometimes they went from private hands to the museum collections, as is the case with the IEAA pieces. And here is a map showing the modern distribution of these pieces. Some, like for example, the area marking New York. This is the last known area of a couple of these pieces. They were sold at 2 different auctions, and the current whereabouts actually are unknown. The other pieces, designations shown here, actually indicate the museums where these pieces actually are located. Now, I'm going to start with a general description of the pieces, move on to discussing the types of texts and images that we'll see on the pieces, and then go right into the pieces themselves and describe them, translate them, before moving on to reassembling those pieces and reconstructing them, and then talking about the iconographic program. So I'll put the first image up just simply as I'm giving this general description. The limestone used for Minas sarcophagus is of inferior quality, and it required a good deal of repair throughout, basically applying gypsum filler to the many blemishes on the surface. Some of the cracks probably occurred during the original transport and placement in Minas tomb shaft, though undoubtedly some of the damage would have occurred during its dismantling in modern times, and possibly even after sale of the pieces on the antiquities market. I'll mention one of the pieces, the second piece that I'll show of the Glenn White collection. We don't know if this piece was actually broken before Glenn White purchased it, sometime while he actually owned it. All we know is that when it came into the collection of the University of Memphis, the IEAA, it was already broken. So the carving of the hieroglyphic signs is rendered in sunken relief, and they're pretty crude and simplified. There's little internal detail. The dividing lines of the text are somewhat misaligned, and the figures are depicted with overly large eyes and disproportionately sized arms and hands. In short, the craftsmanship employed in the construction and decoration of the sarcophagus is consistent with that of a provincial artist and lacks the refined quality commonly found in royal examples. Now, looking at the types of texts and images that we will find on the sarcophagus, there are 9 pieces total, and that we have right now. One of those 9 pieces actually is the broken piece that we'll talk about in a bit. And 8 of the 9 sarcophagus fragments contain the image of various protective deities and an accompanying lines of text there as well. The 9th fragment bears only part of an arm of a deity and a depiction of the Ujat eyes. The bulk of the texts are selections from chapters 151 and 161 of the Book of the Dead, commonly found on both royal and private sarcophagi of the New Kingdom. 6 fragments contain the formula Jed Medu Yen, recitation by or words to be said by, usually introducing the direct speech of a god or goddess. As we'll see, the texts do not refer to the figure in front, so viewers left, but rather to the figure which was originally behind them, often now located on other fragments. And this is due, once again, to the looters sawing and cutting these pieces, but not having any idea what the text actually said. So they're not keeping the image of the god with that god's speech. They're simply cutting and making sure they get a figure plus text accompanying that. The first piece I'll talk about is this piece that you're looking at right here from the IEAA collection. And I'm designating these pieces by letters of the alphabet just for ease of reference later on when I'm reconstructing them. So I'll call this piece fragment A, but obviously you've got the full museum inventory number, 1994.4.167A here. So this particular image, fragment A, depicts the god Thoth appearing in the form of an ibis-headed human, gripping a vertical standard topped with the sky hieroglyph. To the right of the figure appear 2 rows of text framed by vertical lines, and the 2 bands read left to right are as follows. Imseti, the Osiris Mer Mena, justified. Words spoken by Imseti, I have come that I may be. Now, the translation of Hadia, as I mentioned before, as Meir, really approximates the likely role that Mena played in Ninnesut as a local authority figure. There are a number of variations of how to translate this particular term, and really it depends on the historical context, the time period of the individual that owns this particular title. Mena would have lived during the late 18th and early 19th dynasties, and that's really based on an understanding of the fragments found in his tomb, that Mycenaean stirrup jar, and the black coffins are going to help to really cement when Mena would have held this particular position of Hatia. During that particular time, and given his location, probably then he is going to have the responsibilities of tax collection, of facilitating the work of representatives of the central government, and then implementing the orders that he receives from them. Whatever its precise function might have been, this is the only professional title that Mena uses for himself on the coffin. So Mena's identity as a Hatia is really what he wants others to know, and that's why this title appears a number of times on the sarcophagus. Now, there would have been a third line of text that followed after Thoth here. And unfortunately, this third vertical band was actually not preserved. So it's actually the sarcophagus piece was cut, and it takes away that third line. I think that the third band of text would likely have read, and I've got it here on the slide on the right-hand side. I think it would have finished. So words spoken by Imseti, I've come that I may be. I think what would have completed that would have been a vertical line that would have said, I may be your protection, Imseti, the Osiris Mer Mena, justified. Now, the second piece we'll call fragment BC. Remember that these are two different pieces that were part of the Glenn White bequest. We see here on this piece the falcon-headed god Kebasenuef, positioned right in the center. And to his left runs a vertical band of inscription. And this vertical band of inscription reads the Osiris Mer Mena, justified of the city of Ninnesut. There are additional hieroglyphs forming part of the name of the town Ninnesut that are present at the top right-hand portion of the fragment. And obviously, the rest of the inscription that would have formed part of has been removed because of the way this piece was actually cut. Another pair of fragments, we'll call fragments D and E, actually resides at Chiddingstone Castle in Kent, England, and are part of the Dennis Eyre Bauer bequest, where they bear the inventory numbers 8 and 9 respectively. They were ostensibly purchased on the antiquities market in London sometime during the second quarter of the 1900s. And the first of these contains 3 vertical lines of text to the left of the jackal-headed god Duamutef, with the hieroglyphs for the town of Ninnesut in the top right corner. The 3 bands of text to the right of the figure proper read, Kebasenuef, the Osiris Mer Mena, justified. Words spoken by Kebasenuef, I have come that I might pull together the limbs. The Osiris Mer Mena, justified. Now, there are some curiosities to some of the texts, and some of this might have to do with the fact that it's of a provincial nature. For example, Kebasenuef, the Kebe part of the name of Kebasenuef is actually omitted in the spelling. And so one wonders why that was left off. It may simply have been just that the artist did not have space to put it in and left that out. Fragment E also contains a representation. In this case, it's a representation of the god Anubis, and we'll have to determine the other piece if we're talking about that piece really being Anubis or Duamutef. These two canine-headed deities look very similar, Duamutef and Anubis, and so really it's in the reconstruction that we'll see which specific texts allow for their respective identifications. This particular figure is positioned facing to the left and standing in front of 3 lines of text. And the first inscription, once again, contains the name of the deceased. All right, so the Osiris Mayor Minna, justified. The second and third bands of text state, words spoken by Duamutef, welcome to me, O nodder of the head to the bones, the Osiris Mayor Minna. Fragment F presently resides in the British Museum and is inventoried as EA 69674. It was acquired on the London Antiquities Market in 1985. It depicts part of the upper body of the goddess Nephthys, including her right hand, shoulder, and head, atop which she wears the symbol of her name. Now, Nephthys is a god closely associated with death, but also with the characteristics of a healing deity. She's the sister of Osiris and the daughter of Geb and Nut, the gods of the earth and sky. To the left of the goddess is the name of the town Nen-Nesut. Now, obviously, it's very difficult to make out what exactly is here on the left-hand side, but you can see with the drawing, really what is part of here is the town Nen-Nesut, so the name of the town, and then just 2 partial glyphs probably that form part of Minna's name. And there's another glyph down here, this Ha sign, which formed part of the inscription, but you can see that this particular piece is very badly damaged and only includes just a portion of the text that was actually there. 2 other pieces reside at the San Antonio Museum of Art, and they are a part of a gift of the Gilbert M. Denman Jr. And I'll call them fragments G and H, and you'll be able to see, obviously, the inventory numbers here. These 2 particular fragments, G and H, also contain images of deities. Fragment G here contains a striding figure of the god Imseti, so he's the one human-headed deity. To his right are the hieroglyphs for the city of, to his left are the hieroglyphs for the city of Nen-Nesut, so just small parts of that. And obviously you've got a little bit of broken inscription there in front of him as well, which unfortunately is no longer there. To his right, the first inscription reads, he who is in the place of embalming, the Osiris Mayor Minna, justified. And beneath that, words to be recited by Anubis, who is in the place of embalming, the Osiris Mayor Minna, justified of Nen-Nesut, shall not be weary. Fragment H contains the figure of the jackal-headed god Duamutef. Now, to his left are the last part of the deceased's honorific title and justified, followed by the name of his city, Nen-Nesut. To his right is a band of text which reads, representative of Re, the Osiris Mayor Minna, justified. The last 2 pieces of Minna sarcophagus that are known were actually sold at auction and are currently in unknown private collections. Fragment I was sold at Sotheby's in 1988, and the decoration consisted of the figure of Isis, and who is shown, basically we have down to the knees that is actually preserved, who is shown in a form-fitting dress with a broad collar. The symbol of her name rests upon her head, and on each outstretched arm she wears an ankh. To the right of the figure are two columns of text which are cut off. The first line reads, from right to left, words said by Isis, the Great One, Mother of the God. The second line includes a seated figure which likely served as a determinative for a word from the first line, but it's not possible to determine what that word might have been. The remainder of the inscription reads, my arms are around, and probably here what is to be finished is you. Fragment J was purchased through Charles Eade Limited in 1974 and contains more text than any other piece known to exist. A pair of Ujat eyes adorns the top right corner with 3 columns of text below. The first line states, or the first 2 lines, I should say, state, words said by Thoth, the representative of Re, may Re live and the tortoise die, may he who is in the sarcophagus be whole. The third line states again, the Osiris Meir Mena, true voice of, and we have here the text is broken off a bit. And to the left of the Ujat eyes appear 2 more lines of text, which read, words said by Nephthys, who is in charge of the temple of the Sokar bark, I have placed my arms, and probably it's to be finished here, around you. Now, after talking about these pieces, it's actually possible to determine the probable location of these fragments on the original intact sarcophagus. Even if Brunton doesn't give us a drawing, we can kind of make some sense of this. The iconographic scheme on Mena's coffin is similar to other non-royal stone examples, such as those belonging to a number of other private individuals. Now, in looking at this list, not to overwhelm you, this is actually just a partial list of some of the individuals, private individuals known to have stone sarcophagi. Some of these figures are very well known, such as Senenmut and Paramasu, who would later come to be Ramses I. But what I want you to notice on this list is that most of these figures, so Mary Mose, Viceroy of Kush, Amenhotep Hui, Chief Steward of Memphis, Amenhotep, son of Hapu, Royal Scribe, Nehi, Viceroy of Kush, Prehotep, Vizier. Most of these individuals are really high status individuals. You don't find many Hatiyas on here at all. What you do find is one example of an individual that might be kind of close to Mena, and that is Wabset, the very last figure here, who was a necropolis worker in Soleb. And I'll talk about him in just a little bit. That's probably the best parallel for Mena's status, and unlike all of these other figures. Each of these examples more or less follows the same basic decorative and textual pattern found on royal sarcophagi from this period. Now, I've looked at each of these sarcophagi, and I won't have time to go into and show images of all of them, but there are a number of features that are pretty common among all of them. Most of them include the 4 sons of Horus, the protective goddesses Isis and Nephthys, Thoth, several variants of Anubis, Nut, and the Ujat eyes. Of these common elements, the only ones that are absent from Mena's sarcophagus are Hapi and Nut. Now, Nut's absence is understandable since her usual location is on the lid of the coffin, and we as yet have no trace of either the lid or the base of Mena's sarcophagus. It is likely that both her figure and some related text would have appeared on Mena's lid as well. So if we ever found Mena's lid, we probably would find an image of Nut. As for Hapi's absence, his figure and text are most likely on one of the missing pieces of Mena's sarcophagus. And basically the whereabouts, obviously, of those would be still undocumented. The remaining 4 sons of Horus are demarcated by their animal fetishes, save Imseti. So most of these other sarcophagi you find the images of the four sons of Horus with their animal fetishes, and with Imseti depicted as human form. So these genii are usually depicted on these sarcophagi. So Duamutef and his jackal-headed guys, Kebesenuef and his falcon-headed guys, and so forth. All of the Minna fragments discussed above either belong to the sides or the ends of the sarcophagus. Now, we're going to try to reconstruct this, and I will bring up the west side first and place these images, drawings of the images, on the west side, and then we'll move to the east side. At the head and the foot ends, respectively, would have come Nephthys and Isis. Now, I'll start out, and because we're doing the west side, I will show the image of Nephthys, and I will show sort of how this progresses from that. But we'll bring up Isis when we talk about the east side. Fragment J contains an upraised left arm, viewer's right. And if we think about that in conjunction with the figure of Nephthys, that arm belongs to Nephthys based on the content of the accompanying bands of text, which includes that speech by this goddess. Thus, J is likely to have been adjacent to F, and that would place the former on the west side of the coffin. Now, I'm showing you this image right now, then I will show you where this piece actually goes here. This piece is curved. Both of these pieces are curved, and so they're likely to have been at the sort of head end of the sarcophagus here. And so the way that would have wrapped around, you're kind of seeing those Ujat eyes looking at you here on the west side. Given that this piece also includes the Ujat eyes, and their proper placement is normally on the east side, its position requires some explanation, and I'll mention that in just a little bit below. From here, we can proceed down the remainder of this side towards the foot end. As J contains a speech from Thoth, this figure would have appeared just following it. Since fragment A includes an image of Thoth, this piece fits logically next to J. So here we go. The various speeches on each section help to provide clues as to the placement of the rest of the pieces, since, as previously mentioned, the sarcophagus was sewn in such a way as to preserve a figure and bands of the text on each section. Remember that it made it more attractive on the antiquities market. However, the appropriate texts were not maintained with their corresponding figure on these sections. So connecting the images with the text allows us to fit each piece together, much like a puzzle on either side. Fragment A contains a speech by Imseti, and thus G, with the image of the same god, would have connected to it. So here we are. The speech on fragment G is actually one made by Anubis, and therefore would have joined with E, which includes his image. So here is that image there. As this piece contains a speech by Duamutef, the final piece of the west side of the sarcophagus would be H. There we are. Only 2 of the extant fragments are from the east side of the sarcophagus. And with so few of those pieces, a reconstruction of this side is conjectural at best. So just a warning there. And it relies on common elements found in contemporary private and royal stone coffin examples. So let's move to the east side and see what we can tell. Fragment B looks very similar to H in terms of its minimal use of text in its decorative scheme. And like H, B includes the name and titles of the deceased, and probably would fit nicely at the foot end on this side. I remember I mentioned that Isis comes at the very end, the back end of the coffin, and so I'll put that image up again. The only remaining piece to consider is D, and this piece would seem to come right after B, as it includes a speech by Kebesenuef, and you have that piece featured here. The jackal-headed deity on D could be either Anubis or Duamutef, Given the arrangement of gods on the western side, I think it probably would be more fitting if it is Anubis who is being represented, thus paralleling the position of this god on the opposite side. The remainder of the east side, heading from towards the front of the sarcophagus, would likely be, so this is all conjectural, I'm reconstructing this based on, hypothetically based on what I expect to come next. You would expect a speech by Anubis, a depiction of the only one of the four sons of Horus that thus far has not been represented, which would be Hapi, along with his utterance, so text of his utterance. Probably another figure of Thoth with his standard and pronouncement, and finally the Ujat eyes matching those on the west side of the sarcophagus. Now, I have to admit, the placement of the Ujat eyes on the east and west sides of the sarcophagus would be atypical, but there are some parallels in the aforementioned examples above from those private sarcophagi that do actually have those. For example, the sarcophagi of both Paramasu and Wapset have one Ujat eye on each side of their sarcophagi, respectively. So this would lend maybe some weight to the proposed presence of those eyes on both sides. However, also it shouldn't be ruled out that it's possible that only one set of Ujat eyes might have been on Mena's sarcophagus, and they simply might be on the wrong side. There is another example from the non-royal sarcophagus of Raya, an individual named Raya, who includes only one, like a single Ujat eye, and includes that on the west side. And on the other side of the sarcophagus, where the Ujat eyes should have been, there is a recumbent jackal that basically occupies that position. So it's not out of the realm of possibility, given the provincial nature of this sarcophagus, that you might have simply had the Ujat eyes placed on the wrong side. And finally, to round out this side of the sarcophagus, I would expect another speech from Nephthys as well. Now, I want to briefly just mention some aspects of the iconographic program of the sarcophagus itself. It's one thing to reconstruct it, but what do these sort of pieces all mean together? I mentioned that spell in chapter 151 of the Book of the Dead, texts from that actually appear on the sarcophagus. And chapter 151 sort of visually represents a burial chamber and its contents, and depicts the various gods whose tasks are to preserve the physical body of the deceased, such as they're doing for Mena here. This chapter is quite common. Many versions of it exist. And so you can see, just like in the position and arrangement of those figures on the sarcophagus, that Isis and Nephthys are there, enclosing, protecting the body from harm. Those four sons of Horus are depicted here, and this is the papyrus depictions of these individuals, the four sons of Horus, guarding those internal organs. And obviously Anubis and Thoth being prominent here. And it's very easy to see how the figures and these texts are reproduced on the sarcophagus of Mena. Another chapter, chapter 161 of the Book of the Dead, is not very prominent in papyri documents. There's only one papyrus that I'm aware of, PB L3092, belonging to one Nefer Web Enef, a noble of the 18th or 19th dynasty, who includes 161 on this papyrus. But the text of this actually occurs on a number of private and royal sarcophagi. Now, here you can see the figures of the four sons of Horus here. I mentioned this in the previous slide, just showing who those are: Hapi, Duamutef, Kebasinoef, and Imseti. And then Anubis, Thoth, Isis, and Nephthys being the other figures that are on the sarcophagus. One interesting aspect of 161, chapter 161, is this idea of Thoth holding this standard. He's basically breaking open the sky. And this particular chapter has this text that accompanies it: "As for any noble dead for whom this ritual is performed over his coffin, there shall be open for him 4 openings in the sky, one for the north wind, that is Osiris, another for the south wind, that is Re, another for the west wind, that is Isis, another for the east wind, that is Nephthys. As for each one of these winds, which is in its opening, its task is to enter into his nose. No outsider knows, for it is a secret which the common folk do not yet know. It is truly a secret which none of the people should know. This particular text gives an idea, of course, of it being secret. However, it's not so very secret in terms of how many sarcophagi it eventually is going to appear on. So obviously the democratization of this spell does not take long, considering how many sarcophagi and coffins bear this text. This particular standard, though, gives an idea. The Thoth holding the standard, breaking through the sky, to open the gates of heaven. In this action, Thoth is actually bringing the breath of life to Menna and thus allowing him access to the afterlife. Also in chapter 161 in On Menna's sarcophagus is another line of text from this. And here you have in spell 161, may Re live and the turtle die, or the tortoise die. May he who is in the sarcophagus be whole. Now, many versions of this on 161, here you have, may Re live and the turtle die, the corpse is interred, and the deceased person's bones are reunited. Here another one, may Re live and the turtle die, he who is in the sarcophagus and in the coffin is stretched out. The tortoise, perhaps due to its dark underwater habitat, was seen as an enemy of the sun god Re, and the evil reputation of the tortoise was probably due to its nature of biting, of maybe grabbing its prey as it comes within reach. There is a tomb chapel, wall of a tomb chapel of a 19th dynasty Theban noble named Neb-Wenef, I'm sorry, in TT 157. And this scene, which is actually here, you can see the tomb owner harpooning a tortoise. Accompanying the scene is also a text which states, may Re live and the tortoise die. So just as on the sarcophagus, just as on the papyrus discussed here. So by killing the tortoise, Neb-Wenef here is making sure that no chaos exists in his afterlife. Now, these texts and images on the sarcophagus in general provide for the spiritual and physical well-being of the deceased, and in this case, Menna. As was standard on coffin decoration, Isis and Nephthys are positioned at the head and the foot end, respectively, where they enclose the body. They're performing the same role for Menna as they did for Osiris in mythology, watching over his corpse and keeping his body intact until his resurrection. This is further emphasized in the linking of Menna's name with Osiris some 10 times on the coffin, and that number likely would have been at least a dozen when the missing fragments are considered. Those representations of the four sons of Horus adorning each side panel perform the Stundenwachen, or the night ritual for Menna. On those canopic jars, as we've seen, those genii have specific associations with various internal organs, the lungs, liver, the stomach, and the intestines. And by presenting them on the sarcophagus, further protection for Menna's corpse is assured. And this is enumerated in those various protective spells spoken by those gods. Now, it would be nice if I was able to complete the entire sarcophagus. This right now is where things stand. It is hoped, though, that maybe some of those additional pieces, for example, a piece with the figure of Hapi on it, will be found in the future. And at the very least, maybe someone watching this particular lecture will recognize a piece that they've seen in a private collection or a museum and understand that it belongs with Menna's sarcophagus, so that eventually one day, maybe Menna will once again have an intact sarcophagus, at least virtually, if not in physical form. Well, thank you very much for letting me share the research on this sarcophagus. And I appreciate the interest, and very much looking forward to the great things that are happening with the IEAA in the future. Thank you.